Hello, and welcome to the Moore Global M&D Summit Series. My name is Mark Fagan. I'm the Moore Global Industry Leader of Manufacturing and Distribution and a partner at Citrin Cooperman based in New York. I'm here with Kevin Ricci, co-leader of Cybersecurity for Citrin Cooperman, and Benn Davis, a data privacy expert and director at Moore Kingston Smith in London. We're here to talk about the cybersecurity threat business owners face in 2021, how the pandemic has increased those risks, and how we manage those risks going forward. So Kevin, give us an overview right now of what you are seeing with cybersecurity risks in the M&D sector.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, throughout the world, and I think this is reflected even in our client base, we're seeing a surge in the number of ransomware attacks, and the M&D sector is no exception. Report after report backs up this observation, showing that this sector is certainly being singled out as the victim of choice for ransomware attacks perpetrated by cyber criminals. Cybersecurity researchers recently released a report showing the number of publicly recorded ransomware attacks against the manufacturing industry has tripled in the last year alone. And just the first few months of 2021, we've witnessed many examples of these types of attacks.
So yeah, we'll talk a little bit about how to protect these companies later on, but I want to switch to Benn. Now, obviously, with COVID, it made it even worse, I would think, because the world, including Benn in the UK, a lot of us have been working either completely remotely from home with our businesses or some kind of a hybrid. What has that done to affect the cybersecurity threat?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think what we forget is that many businesses, and especially in M&D, we're just not equipped to deal with this fast pace of change brought on by home working. You know, you've got pre-pandemic, who would have thought that we'd been having conversations about not going back to the office or certainly changing our work pattern? You know, what we found is that many larger companies were just so far behind the curve in terms of IT technology, using internal servers and storage along with standard desk PCs. When in fact, this new world means that businesses are having to accelerate their IT plans and their investment. And it just means that they haven't been agile in where they are in their program. And I think this has been brought on by the huge challenge you mentioned earlier, what we call bring your own device, which, in other words, means working from our personal devices at home. And what we're seeing is people at home are just using substandard equipment or even shared family PCs, and this is fraught with so many problems such as password policies or unsecure VPN connections. And alongside this, our home environment is so familiar to us and where we're less guarded, and it only helps the hacker's job become so much easier. So to give you a real example, which only happened to me yesterday afternoon, I was on a conference call with a CEO of a medium-sized organization. He was on the call with me with two other staff, and we're talking about data protection and information security. And in the middle of talking, he just got up and left the screen, walked away from his computer. We couldn't see him. And we waited around for, 2 minutes? He came back and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. We just had a torrential downpour. The cat couldn't get back into the house." And as ridiculous as that sounded, I thought, it just made you so completely off guard, distracted whilst working from home. And this is a prime example of us not understanding the real risk around us whilst in this environment. And on top of that, last week it was reported in a national news organisation here in the UK that a survey has just shown us that over 6 million households here have not updated their routers since 2018, leading to sort of huge data security risks. And it's real worrying. And I think it's a perfect storm for malware infections. And you look on the slide attached on the screen here, and what you can see is that the concerns relating to security is that 72% of people are worried about data leakage and loss. And I think that just adds to the sort of worry around this, all of this.
If I could just add to Benn's excellent insights, I think we're seeing increased risks related to working from home here in the United States as well. A recent survey showed that 1 out of every 5 of their respondents had experienced some type of data incident as a result of working remotely, just to kind of drive that point home. And almost half the people responding cited distraction from their home environments as the reason for being tricked into a spear phishing email. And this is understandable. I mean, Working from home equates to having roommates, pets, spouses, children, splitting our focus, leaving us more preoccupied than we might otherwise be in an office, again, to reflect what Ben had just spoken about. So, and I think compounding this battle for our attention is almost 15 months of this sedentary sameness, turning every day into what I call blur's day, leaving us less vigilant than we might otherwise be in an office environment. And from a technical perspective, again, mirroring what Ben just shared, a recent statistic that caught my attention was an estimated 86% of home routers have never received a firmware update. Now, that's frightening because some routers may be several years old and vulnerable to compromise, potentially leaving traffic exposed to criminals. And even if we're fortunate enough to have weathered the worst of the pandemic, over 3/4 of CEOs agree that remote collaboration is not going away. And it's widely believed that a hybrid home and office approach will be taken by many companies. So that means that the importance of reiterating cybersecurity awareness and best practices for users working from home should continue to be stressed for the foreseeable future.
Yes, that's my personal opinion. We are going to be in this environment, this dual environment, permanently. And one of the things that I'm really been trying to understand and trying to help my clients with, and it came through in a Citrin Cooperman survey that we just finished up. It's over 200 manufacturing and distribution clients between 50 million in revenues and $1 billion in revenues, based in the United States, but also have a lot of operations abroad. What they're very concerned about cybersecurity, and they're very concerned about how to protect themselves. And what I see from the survey results is the companies that are in the 50 million to 250 to 300 million, those are the ones that don't have the sophisticated ERP systems, the sophisticated, more complex data analytics tools, utilizing those, and also cybersecurity. So when you get into the $1 billion and much bigger companies, they're probably better well protected because they have better resources. It's these others that they're still very large companies at 350 million in revenues, distributors, manufacturers. They're often global. They're often multiple locations, multiple manufacturing sites, thousands of people they hire, but they don't have the sophistication, a lot of what we've been talking about so far. So, Kevin, can you give some maybe best practices that these maybe these type of companies should be following that they just haven't yet?
Yeah, Mark, I think that what we're seeing for that type of company is a pretty good, a mass exodus from on-premise to cloud-based platforms. I think a lot of companies are taking this approach because they feel as though that the security is better. And so there's this mass migration of data, email, applications over to the cloud, again, in the hope that there will be security advantages over their on-premise analogs. But an ominous statistic taken from the latest Verizon data breach investigations report showed that 43% of breaches have involved web applications. So that may not necessarily be the case. So, Mark, I just want to talk for a few moments about cloud security, if you will. And
sure.
I think while the cloud provides certainly some advantages, again, over on-premise computing, when you use the cloud, you have to make a concerted effort to tackle the relevant security concerns. So let's talk about some best practices that these companies that you spoke about should be implementing to enhance their security. First and foremost, for any user accessing a cloud application, multi-factor authentication should be required. That should be absolutely a requirement. So, for example, in addition to users entering a password, they should also be required to acknowledge access on their phone to have that additional layer of authentication. This way, in the event that their password is compromised, which is a relatively common threat, having another authentication factor will provide them with a secondary layer of defense, making it much more difficult for unauthorized users to access their data. Next, for every cloud provider or vendor, they should be requesting proof that they're properly securing your business's data. For example, many cloud providers in the US will go through the process of acquiring a system and organization control or SOC report. SOC reports, which are governed by the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, are an independent review of security, privacy, confidentiality, availability, and processing integrity, and they're available from any cloud provider worth their salt. Customers of the cloud provider can obtain a SOC report at any time, which is typically refreshed once a year. And upon receipt, the report should be reviewed in detail with added attention paid to the section that details the complementary user entity controls. That's really the key section of the report. It's here where you'll find the controls that the vendor has included within its system that can achieve the control objectives only if you've implemented certain controls in your business, in essence, completing that security handshake. For example, if you're not doing user access reviews and an unauthorized employee has access to sensitive data, which leads to a breach, the most secure cloud provider in the world won't be able to help you with that. And if your vendor doesn't have a SOC report, you should consider having a discussion with them as to when one will be available. And in addition to SOC reports, you should also conduct an annual risk assessment for your cloud providers, that third-party risk management process. Are they in alignment with any new compliance requirements your business needs to meet? If their failure poses a significant risk to your operations, have you developed a contingency plan to function in case they can't? And we had several clients that experienced their cloud provider being waylaid by a ransomware attack last year. Pretty scary stuff, leaving them unable to generate financial reports, track employee timesheets, even invoice their clients for several weeks. Now, if that happened to your business, you have a plan that provides workarounds to continue operations until your cloud provider is back up and running. And if not, the impact could be detrimental to your company.
Now, Ben, a few years ago, the UK really made headlines with GDPR and GDPR requirements, how they've affected best practices, how they've affected what we do in the United States when communicating and working with people in the UK and Europe. And now California is, I believe, close to adopting all of those very similar GDPR requirements. Can you talk a little bit about the GDPR framework and how that is affecting business now that we have two different, I guess, requirements?
Yeah, thanks. Yes, it is a really interesting question because the EU and UK GDPR, which is our data privacy law, has found that the US version called Privacy Shield was found to actually be inadequate. Skelm's 2 decision was a key ruling by the Court of Justice of the European Union back in July 2020. And they declared actually the Privacy Shield, and that's the data transfer mechanism between the two regions, so the EU and the US, was actually no longer lawful. And this decision actually has a significant impact on these data transfers, as many organizations, they'd have had frameworks around this, and they'll need to update their programs and effectively rely on an alternative transfer method. But what this demonstrates is that the EU and UK data privacy laws are actually really robust, and companies need to understand their responsibilities when it comes to protecting their data. I find it fascinating, actually, that business owners forget that actually the data that they're holding is not actually owned by them. It's actually us, the individual. It's our data, but sits within their database. And yet data is often the most valuable asset of any company. So it's a huge responsibility on us all to protect this asset. So in answer to your question, Mark, I think the fundamentals of best practice in data protection is to ensure you have a robust framework of policies and procedures. Someone within your organization is the lead for this area, and it's positively cascaded throughout the business, and a culture of what we call data privacy is instilled to all employees. And part of this, of course, is training. And here's a question for you both, I guess. How many companies train their staff in health and safety when onboarding their new recruits? And I bet you both would say probably everyone. That's part of the culture today. And then compare this, how many actually train in data protection? And I suspect you'll find it's a huge gulf between these two. And I think it's a question for every business owner to answer and ensure that this forms part of their strategy. And so let me give you a quick real-life example, which only happened last month. One of the largest law firms within the UK jurisdiction had an enormous data breach. it was through a real lack of understanding to protecting their data how it happened. Firstly, they had unpatched servers running Windows 8, and our forensics team subsequently discovered that the malware was actually planted onto this server 12 months prior to the incident. And once this attack started, they just had no idea where it was even sat on their servers, and they went into this sort of blind panic mode. But the most interesting part of this is that they managed to access the organization's emails and then through to SharePoint. And I suspect you'd go, SharePoint, that's where they're going to get all their data from, and that, hackers would be jumping up and down saying, yeah, we've got it. But actually, the most shocking fact out of this was actually the person in charge of onboarding clients for this law firm actually stored all of their client passports and forms of ID within their email folders. So the hackers didn't even need to bother with SharePoint. They had the whole lot. It's a hacker's dream. There's thousands of passports, driving license, and home addresses of clients. They went on to demand the $50,000 for the release of the information back. And it's just, what astonishes me is a firm of this stature could easily get caught so easily. And it's through this lack of education, the old saying, it won't happen to me. And when discussing data protection with the clients, I always say, don't worry about the fine, or the breach, or the hacker's demand. You need to actually worry about the reputational damage to your business. And that's, in fact, what this law firm has got in its hands now. It's got it's got a PR disaster situation here.
Yes, and I don't know if the states are going to have penalties like what we heard about with GDPR, but it's just a very expensive, non-compliant situation. So, and it isn't just with the penalties, because I do know, Kevin, you mentioned it. I was involved with a breach at one point, and it was just a very simple one, but it had multiple states involved, and each state has different rules and very complex rules of how you resolve it. So the amount of time that's spent on a breach, and I think you mentioned it before, the time to an organization is as expensive as maybe a ransomware or the loss of data, but the amount of time handling it is just tremendous.
Absolutely, Mark. All 50 states, as I alluded to earlier, have their own unique data breach notification regulations, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. There's 50 different rules. If you do business throughout the country, here in the US, and you have a data breach, and let's say you have to deal with 10, 20 states, it's a nightmare, as you found out, based on what you were just mentioning. But I had inquired around as to why there isn't some type of uniform national regulation. Why don't we just have one instead of 50 disparate different sets of regulations? And the answer that I received from a few different individuals is that there is certainly some revenue for these states based on these data breaches, and a lot of states are hesitant to give that revenue up. Because if it's a federal regulation, then they would lose that source of revenue there for the states. So again, with that said, I do think we're getting closer, especially with the Colonial ransomware attack in the news recently. I do think we're probably inching closer towards one uniform set of regulations for all states. So
practically all companies, all in our M&D world, have third-party vendors holding their data, whether it's ADP handling their payroll, software vendors maintaining supplier and customer information. How should business owners manage the cyber risk with all of this being held by third parties?
Yeah, great question, Mark. So third-party risk management is critically important to a business's security. In addition to the security protocols we talked about earlier, including SOC reports, contingency planning, and multi-factor authentication, let's talk about some additional steps a business can take to mitigate third-party risk. Let's begin by talking about third-party risk management in and of itself, which is the process of identifying, assessing, and managing the host of security risks associated with third parties. It would be devastating to work so hard implementing the necessary controls to protect our business, only to have a third-party service provider expose our flank and allow cyber criminals to breach our defenses. A perfect example of this is the infamous Target data breach from 2013, which was caused by a very small HVAC contractor out of Pennsylvania that was victimized themselves by a spear phishing attack, allowing criminals a conduit into the Target invoicing system. From there, the attackers jumped over to the point of sale systems, and before long, 70 million customer records and 40 million credit card numbers were compromised, costing Target about $290 million, according to their financial reporting. And because of the importance of securing third parties, the life cycle of that risk management for each and every vendor should begin during procurement and shouldn't end until the offboarding process is complete. And to accomplish this, you want to begin by creating an inventory of every provider, which may number in the hundreds for a typical business. I think I just saw a recent report that said a typical business has 700 different points of contact with other vendors and other companies. So certainly it's a pretty good undertaking there. You want to perform that internal assessment for each vendor to quantify their risk profile. And you want to take into consideration factors such as access rights and how critical their services are to your operations. And from there, you want to work with your vendors to conduct due diligence to quantify their security posture, looking at factors such as whether or not they've gone through that SOC report process themselves. And to monitor risk, again, critical component here of risk management, you want to conduct assessments based on the vendor's risk profile that you quantify. With lower risk vendors, reassessed every few years, whereas high risk vendors receiving more frequent reviews. And since these risk mitigation strategies reduce but don't really eliminate the chance of a data breach or incident being caused by a third party, you should establish a robust response plan to deal with a potential data breach scenario, whether they're caused by the vendor or really any other factor. And first up, to accomplish that, you want to have an incident response plan and business continuity / disaster recovery plan that lays out communication protocols, roles and responsibilities, and detailed action steps to address those scenarios. And in terms of the difference, by the way, quickly, between the different types of plans, disaster recovery, business continuity, and incident response, well, a disaster recovery or DR plan is focused more on recovering from a disaster, whereas an incident response plan provides steps more related to responding when sensitive data has been compromised. So they are similar, but and there are certainly shared elements, but they are, in fact, two different plans. So. And proactively developing those plans is an investment that will undoubtedly pay significant dividends in the event that an issue were to occur. Conversely, attempting to quickly cobble together a response when an incident or disaster strikes is almost destined to fail because hastily executed reactions will undoubtedly miss some of the key measures needed for a successful and rapid recovery. And when developing those plans, you want to be sure to include key players from all the departments in your organization. I can't stress that enough, Mark. You don't want to make it an IT thing or an IT-centric exercise. I've seen many businesses experience a disaster, and then during the recovery process, there's this exasperation from management and ownership when they realize that the business will, what they're going to need to do to resume operations. Head management and department leaders been involved in the development and testing of the plans, and had IT, on the flip side, reached out to collaborate with them, there would have been minimal surprises. And furthermore, there's a good chance that if management knew that ransomware, for example, would kneecap productivity for more than a week, they probably would have been much more willing to invest the money in resources into backup solutions or hours into the development of the plan in the first place. So while developing those plans are critically important, again, one other element is testing them. And that's often overlooked. I don't know if Ben sees the same things with his clients, but again, the testing is the key component there because that's going to maximize your chances of successfully recovering from that disaster or that incident. And you want to identify areas of the plan that need improvement or that are obsolete because of technology changes or personnel changes. And since a full-blown test may not be feasible, tabletop simulated testing is an acceptable alternative. And similar to when the plan was developed, these tests should involve members of various departments so that everyone understands and practices their roles and can really initiate the responsibilities quite a bit easier in more streamlined fashion. So,
right. And I know, Ben, you have a UK government-backed program, correct, called Cyber Essentials?
That's just correct. Yeah, I mean, it is for much smaller companies, but I think it's an important, it's something really important here, because I think it demonstrates that our government is serious about cyber and cybersecurity. And you're right, it's called a scheme called Cyber Essentials. And there are two versions of it. You've got Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus. And they're very low value, £300 for the basic or £1,800 for the advanced. And the scheme helps, I sort of say, the scheme helps companies demonstrate to their supply chain that they're taking cybersecurity seriously. And I think, again, it starts to build this culture within the organization of cyber awareness. And I think the real positive things for these smaller companies is this certification also comes with free cyber insurance, which many people just don't realize. And although I say it's only up to a value of 25,000, for small businesses, I think it provides this reassurance that they are some way ready for a breach or attack. But I think picking up on what you both said earlier, insurance should definitely feature on everybody's radar in terms of cybersecurity.
Yeah, Mark, if I could just make one point to kind of pick up there, is that a lot of companies, Ben brought up a great point about some of these are being smaller companies that are dealing with this. Chances are they may not possess the resources or the expertise in-house or even through their external consultants to deal with a data breach. So I think most companies should certainly plan on retaining some type of resource, an external resource that could come in and help them in the event that there is some type of data breach, break glass in the case of emergencies. They'd be able to just pick up the phone, have someone come in and have boots on the ground to assist with that recovery process.
Yeah, now I want to jump back to our survey and want to talk to Ben about this next question. Ben, in our survey, 54% of respondents said e-commerce grew significantly in 2020, and 14% said sales grew exponentially. So we're just seeing that companies are going to, maybe in the past 10 to 20% of their sales were through e-commerce. Now it's more like 50 to 75%. What is that doing for cyber security risk?
I guess the straight answer to that is that the risk will grow in direct correlation to that rise you just mentioned. But beyond this, the excitement of getting involved in I think what you find is, companies that are growing really fast normally means that the staff are really stretched and the business running above capacity, with no thought on the sort of basics of the potential danger lurking behind the scenes. Trading within a e-commerce business obviously brings greater risk as well, because they're publicly exposed when you compare them to other businesses and can often be seen as sort of easy targets. I think it's a matter to ensure they have robust procedures in place, and these should include making sure they have the correct SSL certification on their websites, and I would say really, really importantly, carried out penetration testing on their platforms to ensure that their sites are secure from potential hacks. And then what people forget is that a website, it's a shop window into the company, and it needs to be secure. And I always say, how do you know unless it's been tested? And what we find is that even if a company's gone through their cyber and IT due diligence, they sort of miss their obligation to data privacy law. And this is equally important, as their consumers visiting their website need to be able to have the confidence in that brand. And only through this can a company demonstrate their transparency by having, for example, a cookie banner that's legal. And it's interesting, here in the UK, we have the cookie law, which is a piece of privacy legislation that requires a website to get consent from the visitor to restore or retrieve the information on their computer or smartphone or mobile, whatever it might be. And this is designed to sort of protect online privacy by making that consumer aware of how this information is stored about them and used online. And it's about giving them the choice to allow them to say yes or no to whether, which part of the data is collected. We talk about, and that, when I refer to that, I mean, we're talking about sort of Google Analytics and all these cookie trackers within systems. And I think, consumers are getting much smarter in knowing their rights. And I think it's a big must for companies to be ensure that they have transparency when they're engaged with their consumers. We've actually just launched a product called Clear Consent, and it's probably one of the most intuitive platforms, being it's not only globally compliant, but it uses geolocation techniques to recognize the user location and the language to deliver them in the correct data privacy law. And the great thing about this product is free to entry. And, as certainly within the EU and the UK here, we have to, by law, have a privacy banner. And many companies have them. And what they, when you log on to them and it says, do you consent to storing my cookies, yes or no? That is not compliant. And I think most people think, oh, I've got my cookie banner, all is okay. But under GDPR and cookie law, it's actually not. So I think these things are really important. But I think another part of e-commerce is PCI and DSS compliance. And I think, Kevin, you can maybe jump in here and talk about that.
Sure, Ben. Yeah, no, thanks. As Mark mentioned, many businesses, especially in the M&D sector, are seeing a pretty good spike in the e-commerce area. So it's imperative that they make every effort to meet the requirements related to the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, or PCI DSS, as it's commonly known. For anyone not familiar with PCI DSS, it's the information security standard that must be met by any organization that processes credit cards. And in terms of what those requirements are, well, it's dependent on how many cards are being processed and what methods are being used to process them. The more sophisticated your methods of processing are, the more requirements your business may need to meet, such as quarterly vulnerability scans or even annual penetration testing. For example, if you process cards on your website, but all traffic is redirected to a third-party processor and no information stored on that website, well, the requirements for PCI will involve simply completing a self-assessment questionnaire, or SAQ, type A, once a year. It contains about 20 questions related to those controls that you have in place. Very simple, less than an hour to maintain compliance. However, if you integrate card processing into your website and it isn't kicked out to a third party, and the cardholder data does in fact pass through your site, your requirements will involve completing an SAQ type AEP, for example, once a year. And that contains about 191 questions, significantly more complex of a questionnaire. And it's also going to trigger the need for vulnerability scans and penetration testing. So it's a pretty good undertaking, once you depending on how you process those cards. There's about 8 or 9 different SAQs, again, dependent on how you accept credit card payments. So, and if you store cardholder data electronically, for example, in a spreadsheet or some type of financial application, well, the number of questions spikes to over 300, and you move over to the dreaded SAQ type D. So a significantly bigger headache there. So as we can see on the chart, a lot of the clients we work with are not even close to being fully compliant with PCI DSS. Many of them have never even heard of their need to meet the standard. So certainly, a little bit better PR perhaps on the part of PCI to kind of get the word out. But almost 3/4 of our clients have minimal to no compliance with the standard, meaning that in the event of a data breach of cardholder data, they could be looking at some significant fines and penalties, as well as the ever-present reputational damage that could impact future sales. Only 8% of clients achieve full compliance, with another 20% having made some effort to get there. Unfortunately, PCI is 100% or you're not compliant. Even if you have 1 or 2 answers that are negative as opposed to yeses, unfortunately, you do fail the compliance test. So it's important that you are 100% compliant. And the benefits of meeting the requirements related to PCI DSS include mitigating the risk of a data breach, avoiding those fines and penalties, and then demonstrating to your clients that you are very serious about protecting their data. And regarding that last benefit, many of our clients, once they achieve compliance, contact their marketing departments. That's the first phone call, to issue a press release showing their commitment to securing their customers' data. As you can see by the statistics on the slide, spear phishing is an exceptionally effective attack vector. It's working for these bad guys. And over 90% of data breaches are initiated by a spear phishing attack, which is not surprising, considering that over 3 billion phishing emails are sent every day. So you cast a wide enough net and you're going to catch something. So in business email compromise, or BEC, is a type of phishing. It's a subset where the attacker imitates or compromises an executive's email account to manipulate the target into providing sensitive information or initiating a wire transfer. And these BECs are very costly to a business, with the average wire transfer loss costing $80,000 or 57,000 pounds. And that's big for a mid-market company to absorb, no question about it. And while wire transfers and compromised sensitive information is harmful to a business, it's the deployment of ransomware, as we talked about with Colonial, via these spear phishing attacks that can be outright ruinous. I mean, the best and often only defense against this type of threat is awareness, really. Every employee should be provided with the guidance needed to detect and avoid spear phishing attacks. And I recommend even going a step further, and this is something certainly affordable by these mid-market companies, is taking a trust but verify approach. And what that means is, in addition to training, which is critically important, you also consider using tools to simulate phishing attacks to gauge your employees' ability to avoid becoming that next data breach headline. And this will help you determine which employees need additional training, and you'll reduce the percentage of repeat offenders, which account for 30% of data breaches. So it's really important. Again, you really want to provide the guidance, but then test, make sure that they're absorbing it and they're taking in the key concepts. And just a few final points here, Mark. While emails are certainly the preferred delivery mechanism for social engineering attacks, there are other means used by criminals. And one method is known as smishing, where an attacker will attempt to gain sensitive information by sending the victim a text message via the short message service, or SMS, hence the name. And similar to emails, be cautious for any unexpected text message that asks for sensitive information or for you to click on a link. Perfect way to get into a business. Another method is vishing, or voice phishing, where an attacker will attempt to gain sensitive information via a telephone call. So be vigilant for any unexpected requests for sensitive information. One type of attack is someone pretending to be a member of the IT department in one of these mid-market companies where you may not know everyone in IT, and they're going to ask for your login credentials. There's some type of emergency that they need to address, and trying to do the right thing for the company, you may compromise your own credentials, handing them over to these criminals, which again, from there, that's where the fun begins.
But I think to add to that, let me give you, it's interesting, there's sort of 3 billion phishing emails a day, and that is vast, and yet only a tiny percent of these get through, what Kevin just said. But just to prove a point here, last month, we actually had a large global manufacturer, a cosmetics-based company in the EU, and they weren't a client of ours. They contacted us out of the blue, and they've been subjected to a sophisticated phishing attack, whereby the hackers have got the name of the person responsible for their creditors within their accounts department. I suspect do something like LinkedIn, where we all use that these days. And then they infiltrated the emails of the business within the accounts department, found a supplier that they used on a regular basis for relatively large sums, took that invoice, and they simply just changed the bank details. And this company got caught for $60,000 in one transaction. And they called us and said, how could this be avoided? And the simple matter of fact is that they had no grasp of data privacy, no cyber awareness at all in the business, and completely oblivious to any risk. And I know this sounds crazy, because the news is just full of stories on all types of scams and phishing, and yet on the ground, we see firsthand how easy it is and how these things could be avoided by, from what Kevin just said earlier, making sure that your employees go through robust training. But not only that, make sure you use live test environments such as phishing simulation. It's so important, and again, must form part of policies and procedures and roadmap within your organization.
Yeah, the testing is really interesting point, because it can be just devastating of a phishing incident. There was a client of mine about a year ago. The cyber criminals spent weeks watching email traffic. It seemed like, I'm not sure how they did it, but watching the style, the punctuation, the sentence structure, the abbreviation habits of the CFO's email before trying to replicate it and successfully negotiate the controller to wire well in excess of 6 figures out. And the thing with that is, this isn't covered by insurance, correct? Because it's a valid wire. So from what I've seen, what I've experienced, that's not covered by insurance.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I think I spoke to you a while ago about this, and interestingly, this same cosmetics company, they came to us and said, surely the bank should have done their sort of AML due diligence, and how could these people have had this bank account? But ultimately, like you said, it's a wire transaction. It's the responsibility of the organisation to make sure where they're wiring that money, it should be going. And the banks will just wash their hands of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mark, to Ben brought up a great point about the banks. They're not going to remunerate you for these losses. They consider it negligence, and they're really aggressively through legal means spending significant amount of money fighting the legislation to try to remunerate people in the event that there is these data breaches, because I think they know once that door gets opened, every customer in the world will just be saying, "Oh, all right, so we were tricked, into sending this money. The bank is just going to cover it now." So, yeah, right. They're very aggressively, attempting to head that off.
So let's talk about how to attack this problem. We've talked a lot here. A typical company has confidential customer, vendor, employee data housed in company-owned servers, multiple third-party cloud location servers with varying degrees of security, sometimes no degrees of security. In addition, employees are receiving thousands of emails daily through their phones, through their tablets, through their computers at work, now through their computers at home, now with phishing and smishing, voice recordings that could be a problem, and text as well. It's just multiple list of threats. Is there a strategy to try to harness this and minimize it? Is there a cybersecurity strategy that business owners can follow?
I think, it's a really broad question. I think my strategy would be concentrate on 3 points. So first being identify your risk, and this is understanding the cybersecurity threats relevant to your organization, such as email account takeover, so web application attacks, network security breaches, susceptible to phishing. And I think its understanding can be informed through this periodic structured cyber security assessments that each organization should carry out. And then I think secondly, protect your assets. Take steps to shore up your cybersecurity defenses in the areas where you're most exposed. For example, carrying out security audits of your 365 or Google, improve the security configurations, and just testing web applications and penetration testings like we spoke about earlier. And most importantly, I think, we've spoken about this so much, provide effective staff security awareness. Can't stress that enough. And then measure the effectiveness of your actions. And again, that comes back to, carrying out our phishing simulations or even penetration testing, really important. And then thirdly, detect, respond, and recover. So, cybersecurity breaches are, I'm going to say, almost inevitable in this current climate. So put places and measure to help you detect and contain breaches quickly. Plan and practice your response to security breaches. Cybersecurity breaches, when you're in the middle of them, they're going to be chaotic in nature for sure. And I think, you need somebody within your organization to already be the lead point if this should happen. Cool, calm, and collected, not blind panic, I think is really important. And if you do suffer a breach, take time to learn from the incident and improve your response next time. I think, lessons learned are really, really important. Kevin, I'm sure you can add to this. Yeah,
no, those are excellent points, Ben. If I could just layer a little bit onto that, I think in terms of the identify step in your process, couldn't agree more. I think that before even identifying those risks, you should really conduct, again, as Ben alluded to, a mapping of your data, technology assets, where the flow of information comes in and out of your business. Because if you don't know what you have, it's difficult to determine what you need to protect and what you really need to protect it from. And once you've documented your environment, you can then go through the process of assessing the risks that threaten your security. And this can be completed by using one of the many frameworks that are available, or you can create your own unique framework using a blend of some of the tools that are out there. And I would caution businesses to not to rely too much on their internal IT teams to conduct these assessments, as it may be akin to asking a chef how their food tastes. I think a third-party expert most likely possesses different experiences, with these assessments, and can complete a more objective assessment that removes any bias from the results. For example, my team at Citrin Cooperman has conducted hundreds of these assessments, and we've heard time and again from our clients' IT contact that they run a tight ship and we won't really find anything of concern. However, during our assessments, pretty much without exception, we uncover an average of about 20 moderate or high-level risks that can threaten the operations of our client's business. And like many of the procedures we've discussed today, security assessments are not a one-and-done event. They should be repeated at least once a year or whenever there's a material change to the business. Ben mentioned, protect as the second tier there, and totally agree. One of the best ways to protect against a cyber criminal is to mimic their tactics and approach. This can be accomplished by enlisting the aid of a trusted vulnerability management expert, or what I refer to as a simulated bad guy, greatly improving the chances of identifying any vulnerabilities before an actual attacker can leverage them. And this can be conducted, as Ben mentioned, via penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, and spear phishing campaigns. And finally, Ben had mentioned detect, respond, and recover. And one point I'd like to add here is that there's a certain importance of maintaining event logs, which are critically important for two reasons. First, proactive review of these logs can identify anomalous behavior and alert you to attacks before they even happen. And these logs track things such as unsuccessful login attempts, malware detection, and other activity. And you can accomplish log monitoring manually, but this is a time-consuming process and maybe a heavy lift, even with setting up various alarms and notifications. More efficient, albeit more expensive solution is to utilize a System Information Event Manager, or SIM solution, which correlates logs from across your business and uses automation and artificial intelligence to look for suspicious activity, separating false positives from actual concerns that should be investigated. And the second benefit of maintaining these logs is that in the event there was a data breach, these logs can be able to help form a forensic picture of what happened, providing you with a digital fingerprints, if you will, to determine how the incident occurred and what was compromised by an attacker. So,
Ben, who do you see in the UK and Europe implementing these cyber strategies? Is it the IT folks, or is it really using outside people like Kevin mentioned?
Mark, you've left the trickiest question probably to last here. We've covered a lot of ground, but interestingly, it's understanding the difference between IT and cybersecurity. And many companies believe it's the same, and it's absolutely not. Yes, there's a crossover, and the analogy in this case is that within organizations, the IT department keeps the lights on. In running networks, ensuring equipment is properly secured, whilst cybersecurity element of the business should be knowledge-based. And I think that means being involved in training and constantly updating the threats to the organization through incident response planning, as well as having a robust cybersecurity management plan. And this brings me to a really important point. And I believe it makes sense to ensure that these are recognized as separate roles within an organization. And I'd go as far as saying outsourcing cybersecurity element to a third party actually makes sense. This way you can be ensured that the organization is constantly up to date, not only with the management plans, but have the relevant training to build that all-important culture within the business. So I think, Kevin, you can probably add a bit more to that.
Yeah, and again, couldn't agree more. What a great assessment, Ben, that really IT, not to diminish the incredible work that they provide, but they're focused on keeping the lights on, just like Ben said. So certainly, that's their focus, meaning that they're typically, putting their attention towards servers and workstations and backups, and really not so much on implementing cybersecurity defenses and best practices. When Citrin Cooperman completes a score report, which is our proprietary cybersecurity risk assessment, time and again, we see businesses receiving the necessary support and resources that really they need to keep their employees up and running. But once we inquire as to whether they're providing cybersecurity awareness training, or they're meeting their compliance requirements, or if they're conducting vulnerability management, such as pen testing, the answer is almost always no. For example, the average score report related to cyber compliance for the last 100 clients in the area of compliance was just over 30%, meaning that over 2/3 of compliance best practices have not been implemented. IT operations is another Achilles heel we're finding for businesses, with almost 1/3 of best practices not being met, especially in the realm of formal security policies and third-party risk management. Mobile device security is another weak spot, as barely more than 60% of best practices have been implemented, meaning that most employees are unknowingly carrying a potential data breach with them in their pocket each and every day. And for the record, the section of our score report with the highest rating is backup and recovery, but it's still hovering just below 80%, meaning that a lot of potential exposure for cyber criminals exists and can be taken advantage of. And a consistent thread throughout every score report that we complete is that IT is implementing the technical best practices needed to ensure high percentages of uptime, but they're really not focused 100% on addressing today's cybersecurity threats, as well as those that are still on their way. An oversight which can certainly wind up costing them and their customers dearly.
That's great. Listen, I think we covered a lot here today. Ben and Kevin, you've been amazing. We are definitely in an e-commerce world. We are in a cybersecurity threat world. M&D has to protect themselves, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot to talk about for a long time. So appreciate the time, appreciate the insights, and looking forward to doing this again soon.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for
Thank you all.